DataSelf Analytics Deployment, Part 2, DataSelf ETL Connection to Data Source, and Data Refresh. I recommend reading this page carefully before proceeding with the video. To save time, I'll move on. So I'm assuming you already completed the video part 1, where you install the ETL, and you have the ETL open with the plain um, uh, template that you have installed. Now you need to connect to a data source. In our example, we're going to pull data from a Sage 500 ERP system. So first of all, we need to create a connection or a data source name or an ODBC to that data source. If your data source is SQL Server or Excel or Microsoft Access, you can create the data source connection directly into the ETL by doing the following procedure. You click this button, which is the Import Table Wizard. And from here, when you open it, right now you only have one data source, which is pointing directly back to your own data warehouse. But we need to add an additional one for Sage 500. If you were to use another data source, Providex, Oracle, DB2, you name it, then you'd have to use ODBC 32 bits to create that connection, and that will show right onto this page. In our example, because our sample database is Microsoft SQL Server, I'm going to create the new data source clicking the Add button. And then here, I'm going to choose Microsoft SQL Server. I'm going to give a name to this data source. And if it's a brand new data source, you can put any name. If you're using an out-of-the-box solution for DataSelf, let's say, the DataSelf Analytics for Sage 500, then there are standards to follow, and you have to check our documentation to see what the standards are. And typically, if it's from Sage 500, the standard would be DS as DataSelf _ in the ERP name, in this case, Sage 500. So that would be the typical name for the standard data source name we use in our out-of-the-box solution. Next, you put the SQL Server instance name. In our case, it's a local SQL instance, and I'm pulling from Windows Authentication. And just to double check, in our sample database, the database name is Sage 500. So we just enter the database name here as Sage 500 and click Finish. And that's it. You just created a new data source that is SQL Server pointing to that particular data source. If you need to edit later, you can go back to the same icon, Import Table Wizard. You can click it and choose the Edit button and change if you need to. Well, now, if we need to import a table or a set of tables from this data source, so what you do is you go back to the Import Table Wizard, double-click the data source that you want to work with. So double-click it and click Next. And then you can choose the table name from this list. If you click on the list and you type in, let's say, in this case, tar customer, I go straight to the list that has a tar CUS, and now I'm going to find this table here. And you can use the Control button to select more tables if you want to, and they're going to be imported one at a time. In my case, I'm only going to choose one table. Click Next. And now you select the fields that you want to import from the available to the mapped ones. So I'm going to choose a few of them here. Click Next. Typically, we don't do grouping, so click Next. And then here, you can either finish this mapping and import the data later, or you can finish and import now. If you have lots of data to import, we always highly recommend clicking this button. Otherwise, you may have to wait a long time until the data import finishes. Once you click one of these two buttons, if you have chosen more tables to be mapped, the wizard will go to the beginning and you'd have to select the next table, the next fields, and so forth. In this case, we just selected one table, the TAR customer, and I'm just going to click Finish and Import Data Now because it's a small table. When I do that, the ETL will map that table into the data warehouse and import its data. So right here, if I go now to the Browse table, I see the TAR customer. If I click on it, it opens and it shows me the actual data. So that's a very simple and straightforward procedure to import new tables into the data warehouse. Now, what if we want to add this table to a refresh, and then we want to run this refresh on a schedule basis? So to do that, I'm going to go to this icon, which is the refresh wizard. I click on it. And if you're using out-of-the-box solutions for, Sage 100, 500, X3, SalesLogix, Dynamics, you name it, this wizard will be already highly customized with a lot of tables and different steps. Understanding this is the matter for another video, but for now, I'm just going to add the TAR customer table to my first step of the refresh. So right now I'm looking batch 0, which has this name. I'm going to go to the first step of the batch 0, and I'm going to add the TAR customer table to that step. I'm going to click Save. I go back and I press Save. And that's it. I just created a batch for that I can run manually. However, typically you want to run this batch on a schedule basis, and the most popular way to do that is using Microsoft SQL Server job services. Let me show how you can configure that. You can go back again to this refresh wizard, and here at the bottom you can click the properties of the SQL Server job that can run this refresh batch. Right now it's red because it's disabled and probably doesn't even exist. I'm going to click, and by the way, before we create it, let me go here to the SQL Server jobs, refresh, and show nothing is here yet in SQL Server. So I'm going back to the ETL. I'm going to click the properties, and when I say I want to refresh this batch every day and do it at 1 a.m., and I'm going to click Apply. This may take a little bit. That's it. Now in the ETL, I can see that this job, SQL Server job, is called DS Refresh Batch 0 Plain. It will run daily at 1 a.m. If I go now to double check and I refresh my job list, there it is, the DS Refresh Plain 0. And now every day at 1 a.m. it will run this job. Now what really is going to happen? Well, let me show. I'm going to close this and close the ETL. And if you just leave the system, every day you should be refreshing. But it may have some errors that you may have to fine tune until you get all the security lined up and so forth. So the recommendation is to run a manual refresh if you can, to test manually to see if all the connections are proper. So you have to go to the DataSelf ETL folder, which in our case we saved under the C program files, DataSelf ETL, and that's where the DataSelf application is. And then it created these two shortcuts which run refresh batches. And the one we created was the batch 0. So I'm going to double click this one to run that refresh, which will bring the customer table data again and refresh formulas associated with the core DataSelf solution. So I'm clicking that, clicking S, and now the DS refresh is going to import the table and recalculate some extra procedures that are part of the out-of-the-box solution. This refresh in this example took only a few seconds. A real out-of-the-box solution, this may take several minutes, and if your data is large, it can even take hours. But did it work? Well, one way to see if it worked is opening the log file the log file usually is called log and then the project name, which in our case, we're working with a plain project. So I'm going to double click the log file, which is a text file. And when you open, if you see the last section is what we did, the refresh. So it tells the batch 0 is what we ran. You ran step 1 and step 2. And pretty much, it looks pretty clean, no errors. It was successful. That's one way to see if there was any error, is checking the log. The other way is you can open the ETL and then open the table and see if the data was refreshed. Sometimes by looking at the table, you can see if new data came in. Let's say if before it has 67 records and now it has 70, it means more data was brought in. You can also do the same kind of testing using SQL Server Management Studio. Now, when you run the job at night, when the job runs at night automatically, the job runs using another user, the user that runs the SQL Server agent. And that user may not have rights to read data from the data source, and it may fail. So typically, you have to watch the auto refresh at least the first night to see if it was 100% correct. If it was, you should be all set. If you had connection errors, most likely you have some security to be configured to be sure that all the services associated with this data refresh all have reading and write rights to the data source, reading rights to the data source, as well as reading and write rights to the data warehouse. And that's our video part number 2. Thank you for watching.